So let's get into it. We can see here the question. One trait in squash plants is the color of the fruit, and they're given us two examples in the picture above. White fruit are due to the dominant allele F, and yellow fruit are due to the recessive allele little f. Explain the difference between a gene and an allele for part A. For part B, the genes, or the alleles, for the color of the squash fruit combine to produce 3 different genotypes, but only 2 phenotypes. And we should explain how alleles combine to produce 2 different squash colors, white and yellow. And in your answer, you should define genotype and phenotype and state the 3 different genotypes produced and the phenotype for each. Okay, let's get into it. So, in our question here, for part A, it wants us to explain the difference between a gene and an allele. Now again, if you're unfamiliar with these videos, I'm not going to write out my answer word for word. If you want a model answer, they're available for you out there. I'm going to go through, annotate my ideas, the key ideas I think should be relevant to putting into your question. Practicing writing that answer is up to you. Alright, let's get into it. So, first of all, what is a gene? Okay, it's a section of DNA. Not just a section of DNA, but a section of DNA that codes for a particular trait. How does it do that? It does it via the, very shonky drawing, the base pairs on that said DNA. Okay, so we zoom in on a section here, we pull that up, we would get our base pairs. Remembering that A goes with T, C goes with G, etc. Okay. Now, this particular section of code, and not this one in particular, but what it represents, would code for a particular trait, and that would again be our gene. Now, we can have different versions of these genes that have a slight variation. Okay, it may have 1 or 2 of these swapped around or in a different order. Okay, 1 or 2 of these base pairs. They still follow the rule, but just a little bit of that code might be different. And we'll get a different version of a gene, which we would call an allele. Now, the example given would be the color of a fruit. Okay, and that allele would either be white or yellow. So the gene still codes for the color of the fruit, but the specific color, the different variation, would be our allele. Cool. So that's answered A for us. Let's move on to B. And I'm just going to mark this off. Save the rest of our space for working for B. So, the alleles for the color of squash fruit combine to produce 3 different genotypes, but only 2 phenotypes. Explain how the alleles combine to produce only 2 squash colors, white and yellow. In your answer, we will define genotype and phenotype and state the 3 different genotypes. Okay? So let's get into it quickly. Let's look at what information they've given us. They've told us that white fruit are the dominant, the capital. Okay. Our lowercase f, and they look very similar, so I'm going to give my one a little twirl at the bottom there, is our recessive. Okay, which is our yellow. Now, when our plants reproduce, okay, they can pass on their particular DNA. Now, we're assuming they reproduce sexually. So, what are the particular genotypes they could have? There are only ever 3 different types of genotypes we can think of when we're talking about monohybrid crosses or Punnett squares for level 1. And that is big F, or dominant, which is homozygous dominant. And it has the 2 dominant allele is present, so it's going to have a white colouring. Okay. We can have homozygous recessive, little f. Okay. Give me a second while I write this out. Okay. Which has only the recessive yellow genes present, no dominant white genes present, or allele, sorry, we know this is going to have a yellow colouring. Okay. Alternatively, there is a third genotype, one of each, heterozygous, big F and little f. Okay. Now, because it has our dominant gene present, it's going to express that dominant gene as our dominant phenotype, and it would have a white colouring. So, from that, we can see that because two alleles control our genotype, but there are only two genes, we can get a mixture of having all of one type or one of each, meaning that we can have three possible genotypes. But if the dominant allele is present, that will be expressed in the phenotype. So there's only two phenotypes. Okay. So hopefully that's helped answer questions like this, and you can use this as a guide to answer questions kind of parallel to this one. Remember, if you get stuck, don't be scared to have a look at the model answer, fill in any blanks that you're struggling with. If you do that, I would recommend using a different coloured pen. That way, when you look back in time, you know which parts were missing from your knowledge, and you can revise those specific parts. Get out there, get into it, team. Hopefully you're enjoying a little bit of science.